everyone, so my name is Natalie Reckard, and I'm the Associate Director of Residence Life at Florida Gulf Coast University in fabulous Fort Myers, Florida. And so essentially I'm going to be talking about a lot of my dissertation data and what that means in practice. Hopefully you were able to tell that this was probably related to a dissertation by the how lengthy the title was. If you go on to your own doctoral whatever journey, you will learn that a lot of those titles are incredibly long. So for attending this presentation today, you're going to learn about synergistic supervision, which is a supervision style specifically designed for student affairs, and how that style can impact RAs in their role. Synergistic supervision was designed to be used on professional staff, but since there isn't specifically anything to be used on student leaders, I will use something that was for pro staff. A better understanding about how synergistic supervision can impact an RA's self-efficacy. So in thinking about the work that I wanted to do, why does it matter, or why should it matter if an RA is good in their role? Well, it should matter because not all of our RAs are going to go into the field. And so if we can get them to think differently about their role and the skills that they develop to use post-graduation, that is why that self-efficacy piece should matter. And the work that they do and the skills that they build are more than just getting a free room, having some meals, and getting a stipend. And so again, that's why the self-efficacy piece matters. And then how they can use synergistic supervision if they're struggling to create a diverse staff within the professional staff, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So when I first got started, a lot of people say that research is me-search. I'll be honest, I don't know who said this, but it was probably someone in a grad program. And so when you're trying to think about what you want to study, people will oftentimes say research is me-search. You'll think about something that you're curious about yourself. And so I went to Agnes Scott College, which is a women's college in Decatur, Georgia. And so very much on raising strong women leaders, but when I was supervising other females, I found that there was a disconnect, and I was struggling personally more so to reach my female staff members and my male staff members. And so even though this study isn't on professional staff, a little bit of this was about me. And then also as a supervisor, in watching how RAs would interact with professional staff, we would have professional staff members of color, and regardless of what staff the RAs of color were on, whenever we got together, they would kind of flock to those professional staff. And so what did that mean in terms of the supervision they were receiving? Were the professionals of color kind of being exhausted by always being tapped by the RAs? And so how can we create environments that are supportive? A little bit about me, I use she, her pronouns. I never was an RA. I think that's critical for folks to know because I didn't have my own RA experience to kind of rely on in terms of thinking about this. I did a lot of other stuff though. I did orientation, I did admissions, I was on a programming board. So just about everything else you could do orientation besides being an RA. I attended Agnes Scott, which I already talked about. Then I went on to Clemson, and then my doctoral journey was at the University of Georgia. Empathy, includer, individualization, developer, and responsibility. So I have a lot of the feeling strengths, and so I feel like that's important for you all to know because in my work with supervision, I have a strong element of care and people feeling cared about and valued, and so that's why I just wanted to put that out there. So about the research. So I didn't intend to conduct research at 11 different institutions within a state in the Southeast, but I struggled in getting participant responses, and so it was like, let's open it up and just kind of see what we get. And by what we get, I meant what I get, what I wanted my dissertation chair to be happier with. So what we got. So conducted at 11 different institutions within one state in the Southeast. I was really hoping to have institutions that were similar size and similar scope in terms of housing, residence life being all under an umbrella. But again, in trying to get a lot of just participant responses, open it up. And so I got the gamut, departments that were just residence life but had a P3 connection, departments that were both, departments that were old and historic, and then departments that were only like 10 years old. And so the data really spans the gamut. So 1,354 students were contacted and 256 responded. A lot more folks started the survey, but they had to complete it to get a score. And so I had to throw a lot of the data out, but still got a really good response rate with 18.9, and so I was very happy with that. It was a quantitative study, and initially it was sent out via emails, and so I worked with the CHOs, SHOs at different institutions, and then when the response rate was challenging, I went and personally asked the RAs to complete this themselves. That I didn't necessarily want to do that because that meant a lot of traveling, but it was really helpful because it got me to talk about my research and how important it was. And then I got to see the students that were filling that out, and that kind of had an impact on me, even though I couldn't tell you that this student had this responses versus the student over there had that responses. So, but it was helpful to do all that. Used the Synergistic Supervision survey, which was created by Saunders, Cooper, Winston, and Chernow. They created that instrument after looking at synergistic supervision literature. Sorry, let me take that back. Student affairs literature that went as far back as like the 1960s. So that is how they created that instrument. The general self-efficacy survey, that was created by Schwarzer and Jerusalem, and that is just general self-efficacy. So it has no connection to self-efficacy doing this. It's just generally speaking. I asked some demographic questions because I felt like it was important to know who was filling out the survey. I also asked questions like, how many years have you been on staff? What is your classification? Have you had a job before? Things of that nature. And then I asked 3 additional questions related to supervision and investment, and that was on a Reckard scale, and students got to rate themselves. So I think this data is important because it kind of provides some context as where we are. Some of the data is older than others, and so like the first up there in the top left, 65 to 80% of time is spent outside of the classroom. And then if you look at that statistic, and then 70% of that time is spent in the residence halls. Like I said, it is kind of fairly dated, but we're not doing a lot of research on how folks are spending their time, the RA role. And so one thing that this definitely taught me is we kind of need to get back to research the RAs. 15% of college students live on campus. That is not a lot if you think about all the different campuses across the US. And so to live on campus is really a privileged experience. And so are we, as housing residence life professionals, giving people what we say we will give when they live on campus? Are we really doing that? And I think that's important to ask ourselves that question from an ethics standpoint. You know, we charge a lot to live on campus, and so are we kind of fulfilling our promise? And then we have about 68,000 RAs across the US, and so that is a lot of students essentially doing the same job, essentially doing a job that hasn't changed, and maybe parts of their role have changed because we have more mental health issues, and so they may be more mental health focused, but in terms of how we're doing health and safety inspections behind closed doors, people have been doing that for generations, and so should we be looking at the job differently? So the RA role. RA position is one of the highest student contact positions on a college campus. They are the eyes and ears of the university. I don't know how many times I sit in a meeting where if we're asking a question about a student, the solution is, oh, well, they live on campus, so go have that RA knock on their door, see how things are going. That is a lot of pressure to put on an undergraduate student, but that is kind of the role that we've put them in. So RAs typically are responsible for community development, education, facility management, policy enforcement, and administrative tasks. And then the RA position is an incredibly time-intensive, physically and emotionally demanding job, more so than any other on campus. In no other position on campus are we asking students to wake up at 2 a.m. to go talk to a student who has experienced a mental health crisis, sexual assault, things of that nature. And so again, I just kind of put all these things in perspective that the RA role is incredibly challenging. And then if we're going to talk about the RAs, it's also important to talk about the folks that supervise the RAs. It's called differently on different campuses, but essentially the RD role, entry-level professionals live in the residence hall, and then depending on the university, their scope, training, things differ. So the entry-level residence life recruitment process in itself is a topic for senior leadership in housing and residence life because we put so much time, effort, financial resources, people resources in recruiting these folks, and then if they're leaving or they're not staying or they're having a bad experience, that is trickling down to the RAs, which is then trickling down to the residents. And so how are we ensuring that they're getting an experience once they get on our campus? And then retention of these professionals is critical as institutions cannot exist without a leadership position for those RAs. But we all know with the turnover that we have with RDs, how many times do we start training and one staff has no supervisor? And how does that impact those RAs when they see everybody leave at training and those folks have a supervisor and these RAs have someone's part-time focus because that's not really their staff and we hope we're going to fill that position. That happens all the time. And so again, as a field, I think it's really important that we look at that. So synergistic supervision, just want to talk about this for a brief minute for folks who are not familiar. Specifically designed for student affairs, like I mentioned, it's comprised of the following tenets. So it's dual focused with the idea of that if you are loyal to your staff will then in turn be loyal to you. joint effort, and so that kind of speaks to the synergy. If you and I work together, our output is going to be much stronger than if I just work together on my own and you work together on your own. Two-way communication, that includes feedback. I think it's really hard for us to give constructive feedback in the field, but at the same time, if people are always told that they're doing well, when you finally got to bring in the constructive feedback, it's going to come across as kind of a hard pill to swallow. And then focus on competence. And so those competence domains are basic knowledge, work-related, personal and professional skills, and then attitude. Attitude is incredibly hard because it's not black and white, it's very gray. And so it's something that is harder to coach, because what I interpret as a sassy attitude may be different than what you interpret as a bad attitude. Whereas these other things are a little bit more black and white, it's a little bit easier. So you either know how to do a facilities function or you don't. And so then synergistic supervision also goes on to say it's goal-oriented, and so a mutually agreed upon set of goals and expectations. Those goals and expectations could be from the department, from that individual supervisor, whichever. Systematic ongoing process, making sure that you're regularly having those one-on-ones, and those one-on-ones are substantive. I can't tell you how often staff are like, the one-on-ones aren't that important, or the one-on-ones are dedicated for an hour, but it's actually 15 minutes. I really think that we need to look deeper and be doing more with those things. And I get it, not every RA wants to come in and talk for that long, but it's on us as a supervisor to ensure that they're getting a good experience with those one-on-ones and that ongoing feedback. And then growth-oriented. So supervisors are responsible for this, but then the supervisees also play a role. And so I can create what I think is a great professional development opportunity, but anything times 0 is 0. So if you're not willing to participate, if you're not willing to engage, then it doesn't matter how great it is. Self-efficacy, so it's the conviction that one can successfully execute the behavior required to produce the outcome. In the 2000s, there was a lot of work on self-efficacy for college students, but nothing related to the RA role. But you see a lot of self-efficacy in relation to picking a major, or self-efficacy in relation to fraternities and sororities, self-efficacy in terms of decision-making. And so this study was kind of a little bit different in that regard. Students with a strong sense of efficacy are persistent, higher performing, and more willing to engage in demanding tasks than those with lower self-efficacy. So just so you all have some context about the race and gender piece to my study, due to the lack of research in race and gender and supervision in student staff, I looked at a lot of the counseling research on race and gender, and so that's where a lot of it comes, because in a lot of ways we do a lot of counseling in our work. And then Komavez, I always feel like I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, but she did a study in the early 90s. A lot's changed since the early 90s, and so I don't necessarily know how much stock to put in this. But RAs in her study reported that there was no difference in terms of effectiveness or satisfaction with their RD when the gender pairs were similar or dissimilar. So for her study, it didn't matter who you were paired with from a gender perspective-wise, you still were satisfied with your experience. She did highlight a caveat in terms of the similar versus dissimilar supervisory debate, and that what seems to be most important to an individual depends on their most salient identity, which makes sense, like that's common sense. And then to kind of back that up, Rogers and Metzoff found that gender is more prominent in girls than boys' identity and development, and then children of color view race as more important than white children view their race. And so just to kind of give you some context to that. So talk a little bit more about the scales that I used. So synergistic supervision scale, it had 22 questions, and respondents got to rate the behavior that they felt like their supervisor was engaging in. And so I didn't tell the RAs like, hey, is your supervisor engaging synergistic supervision? Because I felt like that would have gone over their heads. But the questions that were asked were like, do you feel like your supervisor asks you questions before they make a decision about something that's going to impact you? Do you feel like your supervisor is transparent with decision making? And then it also asked some other questions that, in my opinion, kind of borderline unethical if the students were to answer yes. But that was synergistic supervision. The general self-efficacy scale, 10 questions. Again, it was self-reported data, and it measured self-efficacy in terms to task completion, managing emotions, resiliency, and goal setting, which we know the students, the RAs, are doing all the time. Again, the hard part about these scales is all the information is self-reported, and so the supervisor may have thought that they were engaging in quality supervision, But if that's not what was adequately translated to the RA, there could be a disconnect, which would impact the results. So who were the participants that I studied? Of the 256 respondents, 157 identified as female, 91 identified as male. That, since we know that we are seeing more women than men on our campus, that is not necessarily surprising. And then in terms of race, the largest group of respondents identified as white. The second group, Black or African American, they are about equal. And then the remaining identified as Hispanic, Asian, biracial, multiracial. At one point, I wanted to look at what self-efficacy would be between the different races, but because I got such few numbers for some of the racial groups, I decided to kind of forego that. And then also looked at classification. So 79 were seniors, 73 were juniors, and 96 were sophomores, and so that's what we're seeing, right? A lot of sophomore juniors taking on these roles on our campus. So I did not opt to kind of put up all the statistics and the graphs and things like that because I think sometimes people kind of glaze over, but generally speaking, the analysis found a positive correlation between the RA score on synergistic supervision and a general self-efficacy scale. So when they felt like their supervisor was engaging in these behaviors, they felt more competent and confident in their ability to do the role, which should make sense. If you feel like your supervisor is investing in you and you're having an experience, you're going to feel like you know how to handle those sticky situations and those on-call things. But the hard part with the correlation is it doesn't indicate which variable influences the other. It just shows that there's a relationship. So I can't say that the RAs that have a high sense of self-efficacy are more likely to become RAs, which means they engage differently with the supervisor versus the supervision is great, and so therefore they feel more effective in their role. The results also indicated that RAs in same race dyads scored higher than those in unlike dyads on the scales, and these results were statistically significant. And then the results regarding gender were not statistically significant. And so the gender piece is similar to what Comavez found in the 90s, but the race piece, which I didn't find a study that looked at race that I could compare it to, said that racial pairs do make a difference. The RA's self-reported investment in their positions was correlated with their perception and how much their investment is to be influenced by the supervision they receive. And so they were more invested in their role when they felt like their supervisor was more invested in them. And again, that is kind of common sense. We'd assume that. And then the last question examined the RA's self-reported investment in their role and their scores on the synergistic supervision scale. And so that is different than the earlier question because it's looking at how they scored and their reported investment as opposed to just looking at those two scores. So what does this all mean? So should we just hire an all-female staff? And that's a joke. I would not be advocating for that. So what this means is utilizing synergistic supervision increases staff productivity, morale, and overall happiness in the work. And that is critical. That's going to help us in retention. That's going to make us have smarter employees who feel more confident to do the role. Students with a strong sense of self-efficacy tend to be more persistent, higher performing, more open to participating in challenges. And so I think that's important when we're talking to parents about selling the role. And we really don't have to sell the role to the parents because as soon as they hear free housing, they're like, you're doing this job, regardless of anything else. And so, but we're trying to put a value on what this job means for our students. Those things become critically important. The racial composition of the supervisory dyads influenced RA's reports that their supervisors engaged in synergistic supervision behaviors, but racial composition did not show a statistically significant relationship to RA self-efficacy. So they had a better supervisory relationship, but that did not impact if they felt like they were more effective in their role. And then RAs reported that they were more invested in the role when their supervisors engaged in those synergistic supervision techniques. So what does this all mean to practice? Because I think our research definitely needs to influence our practice. Our theory needs to influence our practice. So recruitment. Representation matters, and I think everybody knows this, but if people are working in environments where, for whatever reason, they're having a hard time recruiting a staff that is representative of the students that they serve, I think using a strong supervision technique cannot make up for it, but at least ensure that the RAs are having a good experience. In terms of recruitment, if people are struggling to recruit a diverse staff, I think folks need to kind of self-evaluate what their recruitment process looks like. And it's hard to evaluate when you're in the bubble, but asking other departments what they're doing in terms of recruitment, asking your Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance where they feel like you're missing the mark, I think are all good things that you could be doing to ensure that your recruitment is as best as it can be. Training, and so housing and residence life leadership need to invest in strong training, because if the entry-level staff feel competent, like they know what their job is, that is going to trickle down in terms of how they interact with the RA. We've all had the entry-level staff member who doesn't seem as confident, and they've just come out of grad school, and they haven't gotten the solid training, because our training is multivarious, and it's super intensive when people expect that they need to know everything by the end of training. So having folks that are competent is really going to impact that RA experience. And then supervision. It is critical to ensure that RAs are supervised well, as their experience in the RA role greatly impacts the experience of the residents in the residence halls. We want to maintain our residents. We want to keep them staying in the residence halls. But if they're not having a great experience with the RAs, then more of a reason for them to move off to the place that's close enough to campus, where mom and dad don't necessarily mind them moving off, and without having that student leader. So those, I think, are my biggest takeaways in terms of what this means to our daily work as housing and residence life professionals. So that is it. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I had a question specifically about the survey. Was there any question about the amount of time they were serving as RAs? I see you had a class breakdown semester.
So there were, in terms of how many years that they have served on staff. I'll be honest, I don't remember that statistic right off the top of my head, but I did ask that question because I think, when it's their first year serving as an RA, there's all this enthusiasm, positivity, they're not jaded yet. But after a couple years, their jadedness could then impact how they view their supervisor. And so I think it was really important for me to kind of look at, are we talking about a third-year RA who's kind of just burnt out? Or are we talking about a brand new RA who's everything's with rose-colored glasses? So therefore, their supervisor could be crappy, but that RA is so excited to have a free place to live, they wouldn't care who they're being supervised by. But yeah, I did ask that question.
Was there any question about whether they had multiple supervisors? So they've been RA for 3 years and they had 2 separate supervisors?
I did not ask that question, no. Yep.
Did all the institutions that you researched, did they all provide the free housing, or were there various levels of compensation?
Yeah, so I didn't take compensation into account of my study at all. So I didn't look if they got free housing or whatever the reason was. Out of the 11, 5 allowed me to come and speak to the RAs directly. So I went via an in-service. The institution that allowed me to go to each individual staff meeting is where I got the majority of my responses. And so that paid off. But the places where I just emailed it out to and expected a response, I got hardly any responses from those places. But no, I didn't look at compensation. So, yep.
Institution types, was there specificity about what types of institutions you're looking at? Was there further housing index specifically?
So in the beginning, I started out with only looking at big traditional housing and residence life programs. In the state that I was working in, I would say there were only about 5 of those types. And so again, in order to get the most responses, I kind of opened it up. I do feel like that impacted the responses, because if you're working in an institution where it is all like everything is one department, you're getting a chance to work on the ops side, you're getting a chance to work on the facility side, where if you're working in a department that you're strictly focused on the residence life programmatic pieces, that RA's experience is going to look vastly different. So, but yeah, no, I just kind of opened it up. Yep. In terms of strategies in a one-on-one?
Yeah, like strategies or practices in the
I will be honest that I don't think this supervision style talks about specific strategies to utilize in a one-on-one, but it does talk about the importance of a one-on-one, talks about the importance of kind of like a mid-year and an end-of-the-year evaluation and how important putting feedback in is in that. But I wouldn't say it talks about any sort of like tips or techniques. And one critique I have of synergistic supervision is it really talks about supervision in an ideal way. And so the supervisor and the supervisee very much being on the same page, very much being kind of as one. but it doesn't really acknowledge like what happens when supervision goes wrong, like what happens when you have a staff member that you kind of need to talk out of the position. It doesn't mention all those kind of negatives, and so if I had to critique that style, that'd be one critique of it, is it doesn't really offer suggestions or any sort of support if the supervision relationship is poor. So yeah, so sorry I didn't really give you a full answer. Yeah. My research didn't look at if compensation played a role in terms of their job. From more anecdotally, I think compensation plays a role in terms of how many people are going to apply for the position. Right now on my staff, we're struggling with RAs not feeling valued and feeling dispensable. And so I have an RA advisory board where I talk to the RAs about whatever kind of is on their mind, but I raise that question to them. And one of the questions that I also raised to them was, what makes you feel valued when what does the department do that makes you feel valued? And I would have thought that they would have said, oh, when we have RA Appreciation Week, or when you all buy us a nice dinner at an RAN service. And granted, these are only 9 students, so please don't take this to the bank. But what they keep saying time after time is about the relationship with the supervisor. Everything was about that. When my supervisor notices that I've changed my bulletin board and comments on how great of a job I did, or when my supervisor notices how many relationships I have in the residence halls. And so that was kind of enlightening, because I would have thought that the physical, the monetary things would have been more important. But I think by them saying relationship, it just goes back to what we already know. Relationships are key to everything. And so the RA relationship is key to how engaged the residents are in the residence halls. The RD's relationship with the RE is key to how good that they're going to perform in that RA role. And so my own personal opinion is the relationship, but others could have different opinions about that. So, would anybody else like to kind of provide an answer to her question that she raised?
Yeah.
Sure.
I've been at institutions that had different models, one that had a paycheck, one that had just room and board. I think the main difference is what student employees see as why they're doing what they're doing. I get a lot more questions when they get a paycheck about, well, what hours am I at, things like that, in a way I didn't receive when students had room and board. So helping them conceptualize where is the compensation coming from, and really trying to get past the binary that they might be in. Well, I only work 13 and a half, so I can't do this. Well, that's not really how your job works. So trying to navigate those complexities, help break it down for them, helps you get them to do the things that you need them to.
Okay. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I was also just I think our students are also learning about financial management as a function of just their growth. For example, we had a breaks day in May, and one of them was like, we should pay me more because of taxes. I didn't get my money flat $50.
That's life in the U.S.
It's actually one of the people who we pay you generally than the next person.
Yeah.
So that way it comes out of your taxes differently. And so I think in general, our students, as a function of just learning their lives, compensation is just, in money and financial management, is just something that they're all continuing to understand. I think the financial perks are an initial idea, oh, this can be cool, and if there's a free room. But I think what we see is the time investment energy comes from the space of that self-efficacy, not just the free room, the relationships.
I think the other thing to add, then I'll let other folks kind of chime in. I think because RAs get room and board, and then if they work desk hours, they have some desk hours that they have to work, but then if they work addition, they get paid. I think this idea of, oh, if you ask me to do something in addition, I'm expecting some other additional compensation. And so not this concept of salary that many of us have, this is my job description, this is my salary. If my supervisor asks me to do something else, I'm not going to say, hey, so where's my salary increasing? No, it's going to be like, okay, let me get that done for you. So I think that's a little bit, the tricky part with the RAs is they're expecting okay, you've put one more thing on my plate, so what do I get in return? Right.
So it's people that, like you said, the other dudes as assigned, they might get that.
Right. They're like, oh, I didn't read that.
Right.
Okay, go back then. Sure.
I was going to say, it kind of varies. I've been at an institution where RAs had their room and board covered, and then I was at an institution where they only had their room covered. But both institutions, across the board, we expected the same thing in terms of our housing policy and expectations from them. I do say, at the first one, of course, they had their board provided as well, but I do think that our folks had a better relationship with RAs, and they were happier. But I also think there was sometimes you had to kind of bend the rules, to make it work within your own staff. For my first group of RAs that I had, I didn't ask them to do rounds during the day. I would kind of do that myself. Especially the way my hall was set up too, you couldn't really hide. It was kind of just like out in the open, so I was like, you know what, don't even worry about that, just do it at night. So I think it depends, and it even depends on your crew, so getting a feel of it.
Sure.
I would also say too, I really like, that you mentioned the idea of having like the RA advisory board. We just like recently instituted that, and including student staff like in those types of committees, where you can have constant feedback. You can be at the table. You can let us know if there's some things that we may not be seeing, to give them a part of that agency and a part of the decision making with that. And then also, like at the beginning of every semester when we have training, we try to get them to think outside of, this is not a job, like don't think of it as a job. It's an opportunity, to help develop students, and it's a leadership opportunity. So, it's not just this binary, like, okay, you clock in, you clock out.
Right.
It's just, okay, you have an opportunity to do this and some, and get some out of that, to transfer to whatever your career or your dedication will be after that.
And I think some of our staff that are going into the field get that a lot easier than some of our staff who are like, hey, I'm just doing this because it's fun for right now, but I'm going to be an engineer. So unless you can do a good job of explaining how this is going to translate to my future as an engineer, I don't really know how I feel about all this extra stuff, Yeah.
I would also say too, so I'm also going to try and get my staff to think, with RA hiring and all that, and the re-interviews and all that, if a staff member just does not, they're not meeting that mark, they just do not want to engage, like if you have residential curriculum or whatever those things are, then we have that conversation. It's not a bad thing. It's okay. We can help you define what that best fit is, the best fit for you on campus, and how can I help you get to that point.
Right, like,
You don't have to be an RA.
right. You don't want to hold people accountable? Come meet RHA. Not to say that you can let everything go crazy, but you don't want to do rounds? RHA can help you host some fabulous programs. Like, let's make that connection. Exactly. Yep.
So I currently work at a university that has RAs just get their housing covered, and I think it's always been that way for our university. So it's kind of like, all right, well, this is what you get. And some of the recent conversations has come up, like, what are the efforts to push the position forward? And one of the biggest things that I've started doing is those conversations of what do you want to see happen, and like some of the biggest things that really they just want to see is the effort to make more of what they have.
Mm-hmm.
And being open and honest with them, saying, hey, I'm trying,
Mm-hmm.
but I need more from you.
Mm-hmm.
I need more buy-in, and I don't need those questions of why am I doing this if I'm not getting this and this. I will do this because of the future of the position. I need more of that.
Mm-hmm.
Those conversations that let's, okay, well, if it leads to something better, then let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's some of the fun conversations I'm having right now.
Yep.
So I work at a institution that recently changed from pure stipends to hourly pay. And it was very interesting in looking at the student staff satisfaction surveys, how they were before that change and after that change. Because before that change, they would say, we're not being appropriately compensated for our work. Okay, this is not enough money. And then after, when you started paying them exactly for the amount that they were worth, they would say, you're not letting us count things that are actually worth.
Right.
That, like leaving your door open, walking to the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's just everything. And so, I think that we kind of come to the consensus that it's just been, you're going to get your side of it. It's always going to be a different thing that comes through. And I think that what you said about investing in them, this is all about advertising.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about your supervisor, your direct supervisor, it's who you're utilizing. And that's really kind of the line. Whereas your pay is really more of a or less, it didn't really affect the overall number.
Yeah, and that's something that I say when we go through our recruitment process and I have my time with the RD candidate, like something that I'm looking for is someone who wants to be a good supervisor. And if you're not interested in being a good supervisor or a committed or an involved supervisor, that's fine. Like there's no hard feelings, but I don't necessarily know if working at our institution is gonna be the best professional fit for you. So being clear is kind. Yep. In terms of what? Okay. I mean, I think institution type really, really matters. And so I think if I could do it all over again, making it bigger than just one state, but looking at similar institution types. Because if you have students who are at a large research institution, how they interpret their work is going to be very different than students who are at a STEM institution who are probably predominantly male. And so how they interpret the questions, how they interpret the role is going to look very different. And so I think if I had to do it all over again, more states, bigger scope, but same institution type. I mean, there's a lot of things that I would probably do it all over again. Something that I thought about, so there's the quantitative piece, but what are all the stories that are behind these responses, right? And so that qualitative piece is so critical, but in order to graduate, a mixed method study would have just been not the best road to go. So I think kind of going back and kind of getting those individual stories would be really helpful in terms of the research. Just as a, more research just needs to be done in general on the RA experience. And so I think for us as practitioners, like writing more articles and things of that nature, like I think we need to do a better job of that to understand what the RA role is looking like now. Because we kind of keep piling more things on the RA, but have we done a good job of taking certain things off? I don't necessarily know if I would say that we have. So does that answer your question? You're welcome. Anything else? Well, thank you all. I know that you had a bunch of different options that you could have gone to right now, and you chose to come to this one, so I appreciate it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to share any of my information, so if you want any of my sources, you're more than, if you want parts of my dissertation, you're happy to have that. So yeah, so any way that I can help you get wherever you need or whatever reason you came in here today, just let me know.